In 2005, I found myself on a small boat, a tinny really, on Lake Victoria in Tanzania. My parish, Cronulla, had a link parish in that region, a place called Kabagunda on the western shore of Lake Victoria, and we had raised money for the young men of the parish to be able to fish. And so I had an opportunity both to go and speak in that diocese and then to go and visit the parish of Kabagunda and see the work which we had paid for. And so local fishermen took me out on a tinny with a small outboard motor across to an island in the middle of the lake. Lake Victoria is really big, just so you get an idea, it's huge. And it was about an hour into the lake to get there. And I was to spend the night on the island, and because the fishing was done at night. So they woke me up at 4 o'clock in the morning. As you can guess, I was really happy about that. But woke me up and amazingly going out of the tent that I was in to look at the night sky in Africa where there's no other light at all. It's a sight that I will never forget. But then I was taken to inspect the fleet and the catch and the nets and felt very good about the work that we had done helping people have an income-producing scheme. It was great to be there. Later that day, it was time to return from the island back to the shore, back to Kabagunda. So it was back in the little tinny and off we set. After we'd set off, the wind started to rise. And as the wind started to rise, the waves started to get bigger. And as the waves got bigger, it became harder and harder to steer the tinny with the little outboard motor that was on the back. The fishermen let me know that we weren't going to be able to get to the harbour that we had set out from. We were needing to get anywhere that would be on the shore. And then they started to look a little afraid, which was not something I felt very comfortable about at all. Life jackets are not a thing in this part of Africa. So there was two of us, or three of us, two of them and me in a boat that was starting to flood, and questions started flooding my mind. One was, I wonder how long it'll be before anyone back in Australia knows that I've drowned. Now, obviously, this story has a happy ending because I'm here this morning. But I can't help but think about that experience as I read this well-known story of Jesus in peril on the sea. I know what it's like to have been in a situation like that. And this story asks questions too. It asks two questions. The disciples ask about Jesus, who then is this? But Jesus asked the disciples, have you still no faith? And the answer to both of these questions will bring us both comfort and challenge as we look at them. This story of Jesus calming the storm is one that clearly the gospel writers all believed was important that you understand or know if you are going to know who Jesus is. It's told in all four of the gospels. All the writers believe that if you want to truly understand who Jesus is, then you need to know this about Jesus. But as we think about this question of who then is this, it's easy to jump to the miraculous bit at the end of this short reading. But in this short reading, notice how much time the writer uses to make sure we understand this is part of what went before. Earlier in Mark 4, Jesus has been sitting in a boat on the western side of Lake Galilee, teaching about the kingdom of God to a huge crowd. As Mark starts to tell this story, we are told it's the same day, the same crowd are still there, and that Jesus doesn't even leave the boat. We're told that they took him with them even as he was. So he didn't even leave the boat. It's been a big day. He's been teaching big parables to a large crowd, and he is exhausted. Now, perhaps to sort of end the day, he decides we're going to go to the other side of the lake. Again, Lake Galilee is probably bigger than you think. It's sort of Derwent-sized, or at least sort of down the river a bit, Derwent-sized. You could see the other side, but it was still pretty big. And so Jesus and the other disciples start to make their way across. Now, these boats were sort of like double tinny size, if I can put it that way. It was pretty hard to get 12 people in them. If you go to our Facebook page, you'll see a picture of that I took on the shores of Lake Galilee of a boat of the type of that time. You can see what it's like. Jesus has more than 12 people with him, so there are other little ships that are little boats that are with Jesus as he starts to make his way across the lake. And suddenly, as was wont to happen, or still is wont to happen around Lake Galilee because of the way it's buried, or it's in a sort of a bowl, the wind goes up and suddenly the waves are coming up and all the boats in the flotilla are being swamped. But there's this very human touch that Jesus is in the rear of the boat, asleep. Now, all of the accounts of that day have Jesus being asleep. It's been a big day. He's been teaching to the crowd. He's been having to speak really loudly. He's tuckered out. But it's only in Mark that we're told that he's got his head on a cushion. Now, many commentators get all very excited about the cushion. What are we supposed to mean? Why does Mark tell us this? Well, I think there's two reasons. Firstly, because Peter, I assume it's Peter who's passed this message on to Mark, Peter saw the cushion and he remembered it, so he tells him. And secondly, Jesus is a pretty sensible bloke. He's trying to have a bit of a kip in a boat. He sees a cushion, he puts his head on it. It's what we'd all do. It's a very human touch. Now, I also need to say that some scholars have suggested that Jesus was only pretending to be asleep. He's testing his disciples, but the text is pretty clear. He's asleep, and they have to wake him up, both of which suggest he's really very asleep. This is important because it tells us that we have a very human image of Jesus here, tired at the end of a long day. It's that very human Jesus that we then have to ask, who then is this? Because having been awoken, awoken and challenged by his disciples, Jesus says to the wind and the waves, and all the translations have something like, peace, be still. As if Jesus is kind of a really zen kind of guy. Just let it hang. Just be peaceful. Translations tend to sort of soften the language that you have in the scriptures. A better translation would be muzzle it. Or we would probably say, shut up. That's what Jesus says to the storm. This is it. No more. Stop. And the impact is immediate. The winds cease and there is dead calm. And in so doing, Jesus saves those in his boat as well as the other little ships as well. Jesus' saving power reaches wider than just the disciples who are in his boat. That's a thought that may give you something to pray about as you think about this passage. But please note, this is a double miracle. When winds cease, the waves don't. The energy from the wind has gone into the sea and the waves carry on for some time. For Jesus to calm both the storm, the wind, and the waves simultaneously, it's a double miracle. Now, that also means that this is not just a case of Jesus being good at reading the weather. That he could go, looks like the wind's about to stop, so now would be a good time to get up and go, peace. Presumably, if Jesus was really good at reading the weather, they wouldn't have set out on the trip in the first place. No, this is someone who has enormous power over nature. They had just called him rabbi, teacher, but he's clearly way more than that. No wonder they ask, who is this then, that even the wind and the waves obey him? See, if on that day in Lake Victoria, one of the fishermen had got up and gone, stop this! And everything had gone calm, I'd have been going, who is this guy? That's not humanly possible. And that's the point. This is not humanly possible. And the Galilean fishermen should have known this. Down on our wharf, you have the words from Psalm 107 on the wharf about those who go down in the ships have seen the great wonders of God. I assume that all people who do things on sea know Psalm 107, particularly those who are fishermen on Lake Galilee. And they would know that on Psalm 107, what we call verse 29, it says, God calmed the storm to a silence and the waves of the sea were stilled. Same double miracle. The wind stops, sea is calmed. Who then is this? Mark's telling us there's only one answer. This is God come among us. This is underlined in that the disciples don't cry out to God, they cry to Jesus. But then Jesus doesn't cry out to God, he just commands. He doesn't pray, he simply commands the wind and the waves to stop. The one who had so recently been asleep is God with us. That's why this question is so important. It's the question that echoes throughout Mark. Who is this? And I pray that everyone here knows the answer. That in Jesus, God has come amongst us. God is with us. And we, like those early disciples, should be in awe of that fact. We're now going to take a digression. Now, I'm breaking a bunch of rules of preaching here. You should keep going with your main point and not get distracted, but we're going to get distracted just for a minute, okay? Because I think we need to make an apologetic point here. It's often been claimed, particularly from the time of the Enlightenment on, that is the 18th century on, when they started to go, miracles don't happen, they just don't happen, so when we read the Bible, we're just going to get rid of anything miraculous. The idea developed that Jesus was divine is a late invention of the church. In other words, there were stories going around about a Galilean carpenter who was a great teacher and he sadly died under the Romans, but gradually over time people thought, actually he was better than that, and gradually he becomes the Son of God. That's very hard to maintain when you look at this passage. See, Mark is usually thought to be the first of the Gospels, probably written in the mid-60s of the first century, still within the time of living memory of Jesus' own life. And clearly, Mark is presenting Jesus as more than a simple preacher. We have here really early evidence, mid-60s, of the belief that the church thought that Jesus was divine. More than that, remember, Mark is recording things that someone's told him. So it's pointing back to even earlier evidence of the church thinking of Jesus as divine. In other words, from the earliest years of the church, as they continued to think through all the things that Jesus said and they did, they thought of him as divine. I want to suggest to you there was never a version of Christianity from the early church on that did not understand that Jesus was divine. The option we have when presented to Jesus, when you say, who is this? Just a moral teacher is not an answer. He's more than that. He's the one who controls the wind and the waves. He's God with us. Digression over. Back to the main point of the sermon. So we've dealt with the first question. Who is this? It's God with us. But then Jesus asks a question of the disciples that as we think about it, we might think is a question that's aimed at us. Have you still no faith? Now we might think, hang on, Jesus, this is an unfair question. They came to you. They woke you up. They came to the right person. And they call on him to do something. They're doing the right thing, even if they weren't. What did the disciples think Jesus was going to do? But they're going to the right person. I wonder if we're going to think this through. We need to be thinking through their question. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Now, usually that's read as if to mean this. Jesus, do you not care that we, the disciples, are perishing? What's the problem with that way of reading it? They're all literally in the same boat. If the disciples are perishing, then so is Jesus. And if Jesus is perishing, this whole kingdom of God business is all over, Red Rover. They have been with Jesus for some time now. They have seen him and heard him speak of the kingdom, and it was that was associated with him. That he has healed, he has forgiven, he has shown great power. He has talked about how the kingdom is coming and nothing will stop it. They should have known that if he was the Messiah, and if that was true, if he was going to bring in God's kingdom, then they should have known that Jesus' life was not going to end in some tragic boating accident. God's purposes were not going to be thwarted by a freak storm. If they had truly known who was in the boat with them, they would have known it wasn't going to sink. Now, it's important we get this right. It's not just saying if you just had faith in some generic way, then they should have just known that God would save them. Or to put it another way, if I'd really had faith, I shouldn't have had any anxiety on that day on Lake Victoria. I should have just prayed, God save me, and it would have happened. Yeah, right. Because we know life's not like that, is it? This is not about do you have faith in a sort of generic way. It's a specific thing about they should have known about Jesus. This is specifically about Jesus and his identity and his purposes through him. But when we do understand that God's purposes will not be thwarted, when we think that through, there is great balm for our souls, because God's purposes won't be thwarted. For instance, as we look at the church, we may think of it as a boat that's being blown about and in danger, and in many places seeming to be swamped by the world around it. But it's Jesus' church. It will not sink. God's purposes will be fulfilled. God will bring his kingdom in. More personally, if I had not made it to shore that day, God still would have brought me to my eternal home. And I can trust that. He will bring us through the storms of this life to our eternal harbour. As Christians, when faced with death, we should not be afraid. Jesus does not perish here, but he will perish later, but he's then raised again to say to our fearful and anxious hearts, peace, be still. This short passage then challenges us to think deeply about who Jesus is and whether our faith has truly understood this. Now, over the past month, we've been thinking about how what we learn from the Bible should impact our prayers. And actually, I suspect that our prayer is the greatest test of whether we've understood the two things that are here in this passage. Firstly, do we give thanks to God for sending Jesus to be God with us? Are we in awe of Jesus? Do we worship him? But also, in the storms and turmoil of our life, do we bring them to God? For Jesus says, they say of Jesus, don't you care? We know that he cares. He saves the people in his boat, he saves the people in the other boats, and he died and rose again to save us. He cares. Now, I don't remember whether I prayed that day on the lake. I think I was mostly worried about the water. But I should have done, because Jesus really would have understood. He'd been there. It is a great comfort to know that God has come to be with us. In so many other situations, we should bring them to Jesus. It may not get us out of the situation. Notice the situations that Paul had been in the 2 Corinthians reading. It does not mean we won't go through storms. But we can know that he is with us. And if we will let him, we will hear him say to our hearts, peace, be still, I am with you. He who calmed the wind and the waves is with us, and that brings the peace which passes all understanding. Do we know this peace? Or are we perhaps too timid to wake Jesus up? Or I suspect most likely we're the ones who are sleeping, with or without a cushion. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pains we bear. All because we do not carry, for those better on the tape, everything to God in prayer, an old hymn or chorus, and it remains true. We can pray to the one who can bring the waves and the wind to still, but more importantly can bring peace and calm to our hearts. Christians throughout the ages have found in this story not only the wonder of knowing who Jesus is, but the wonder of knowing that he can bring peace to the storms of our own heart. George Herbert, a poet and priest of the 17th century, a great poet, wrote in a poem called The Bag in 1633, "Away despair my gracious Lord doth hear. Though winds and waves assault my keel, he doth preserve it, he doth steer. E'en when the boat seems most to reel, storms are the triumph of his art. Well may he close his eyes, but not his heart." Amen.